Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this is the second video on the prologue of Joe Abercrombie's The Blade Itself, the first book of the First Law trilogy. And one of the things I have to keep reminding myself, when I'm looking at this text, this was Abercrombie's very first novel. And when you look at all of the techniques and how well he does things, it is really surprising that, this was a debut novel. And I know, to recap then on the second, or to recap on the first video, I left it on a cliffhanger, but we were left with Logan dangling over a cliff edge with both of his hands holding onto this tree root and a large shanka holding on to his ankle and weighing him down. And he's on the side of a cliff. It's a big fall. There's a forest and a river. And that's where we left the scene. So let's finish off this prologue. Shit, muttered Logan. It was quite a scrape he was in. He'd been in some bad ones, all right, and lived to sing the songs, but it was hard to see how this could get much worse. That got him thinking about his life. It seemed a bitter, pointless sort of life now. No one was any better off because of it, full of violence and pain, with not much but disappointment and hardship in between. His hands were starting to tire now. His forearms were burning. The big flat head didn't look like it was going to fall off anytime soon. In fact, it had dragged itself up his leg away. It paused, glaring up at him. This sequence so far has been all about action, all about all of these things happening very, very quickly, very fast, lots of action and development without much introspection. We've been getting these moments where the narrator is letting us in on these insights and telling us these things, giving us this sort of look into Logan's mind and part of his character. And now we start off here with shit, muttered Logan. So again, using expletives, even mild ones like this isn't a fantasy term. It isn't like dreck or frail or anything like that. Straightforward, fecal. But he mutters it, so it's shit. So we get this real sense of the position that Logan's in. Like, he's holding on literally for dear life. And that frustration, fear, anger, and it's just, and if you think the amount of effort required to hold on, he can't yell here. His lungs are very busy pumping oxygen all the way to the muscles in his arm and in his back, trying to hold on to this tree root. So he doesn't have a huge amount of air to yell. And so here we have the shit muttered. So it's that tight, clenched, can't help it. It's just blurted out while I am doing this. And one of the things that I actually quite liked about this, and I maybe forgot to mention it, Logan wasn't hanging on with one arm and just going, I'm just going to dangle here. He grabbed on with one hand, and immediately the second hand came up to grab on, because it is incredibly difficult to hang on to things with just one arm. So he's hanging there with these two, and it's a tree root. It's not a rope. It's not designed for this. So this is extraordinarily precarious. So we get that sense of danger. And now that we know he is very high up, how sheer the cliff is, these little trees sticking out, and the river that's below him, we understand how precarious this is. And we now have a moment of almost respite. There's been headlong action, and Abercrombie gives us this moment where the reader can take a breath, where the reader can sort of assimilate everything that's happened thus far. And it matches with the pacing of what has been happening on the page as well, because up until now, headlong flight, rolling down the hill, he's come off, and now they're dangling there. Now Logan's holding on, and he has a couple of moments where suddenly his brain starts kicking in, and it's not fight or flight response. It's not immediate reaction. This is when your brain starts going, huh, so this is where we are we? Right, let's have a think about this. So let's look at the language that's being used here. It was quite a scrape he was in. So nice colloquial term for being in a spot of bother, being in a bit of trouble, but also scrape. If you think he slid down off the cliff edge, that he had been rolling down through all of these things, that scraping, wounding, that violent adjacent word is actually like the perfect word here to describe this. It's really nicely placed. He'd been in some bad ones, all right, and lived to sing the songs. Now, here's a slight alteration from the common idiom that I would know, which is he lived to tell the tale. And here we have he lived to sing the songs. And this harkens back to the like a skald, or is it a skull? But the idea of those ancient epics, and they recited, they sang songs. This was a type of entertainment. So it wasn't just someone, a storyteller sitting there going, and now this happened. They actually sang them. It was a performance. So by altering that idiom to sing the songs, it gives us that sense of the ancient world, of this older way of telling stories, that they were songs to be sung, these great deeds that were turned into ballads. And again, it's such a minor, tiny little thing, but it adds such depth to the narrative that I think you have to admire how well Abercrombie has done this. But it was hard to see how this could get much worse. So again, that slightly understated, dry sense of humor. It's like he'd been in some bad situations before and gotten out of them, but this one, hard to see how this one's going to get any worse. So it's that dryness, that wryness to the narratorial tone is again feeding its way through here. That there's a bit of fun to this. So although yes, it's a serious situation, the narrator isn't a very stentorian narrator. The narrator is that narratorial tone, that narratorial perspective, has a sense of humor. That got him thinking about his life. And, this is another way of approaching that, his life flashed before his eyes. That got him thinking about his life. And he thinks he's about to die. And when you're about to die and you have a few moments, then maybe, just maybe, some people maybe don't, but just maybe you actually reevaluate your experience. That's what that whole cliche about your life flashing before your eyes are, what your regrets are, what you're proudest of. And now we see Logan, it seemed a bitter, pointless sort of a life now. He's taken this moment. It's contemplative. He's thinking about his life and he goes, yeah, my life hasn't been great. No one was any better off because of it. Full of violence and pain, with not much but disappointment and hardship in between. So not only is this him having a critical evaluation of his life, it is giving us, the reader, a real sense of the type of person that he is, that he has had a life full of violence and pain. And in between those moments of violence, those moments of pain, he has disappointment and hardship. He's not a happy-go-lucky troubadour or Picaro going on all of these funny adventures. He's had a pretty crappy life. His hands were starting to tire now. His forearms were burning. And this is, again, one of those moments Abercrombie feeds this in, and it adds such verisimilitude to the narrative. This isn't someone who can fight for 10 days and 10 nights in a row without getting tired. He's been hanging off here with his weight and someone else's weight. And even though this has not been a long time, his hands were starting to tire because he's gripping this tree root with just his hands, and his forearms. He can feel the muscles starting to burn, very physical feeling. And it gives a sense of realism to this world. He is not some superhuman. The big flat head didn't look like it was going to fall off anytime soon. Again, this very informal way of transmitting this information makes it seem quite funny. In fact, it had dragged itself up his leg away. So he's occasionally glancing down. He's going, this thing's getting closer to my head. It's climbing up me. This is not good. And then we have, again, this moment of humor just to finish off the paragraph. It paused, glaring up at him. And just imagine that. You're hanging there. You're holding onto this tree root. You're hanging on for dear life. You've looked down, and this thing's been clambering up you, and it stops clambering up you to look up and gives you an angry glare, as if this is all your fault. we're in this position because you wouldn't let me kill you. It's funny. The humor here is permeating everything. So I actually think this is very clever. If Logan had been the one clinging to the shanka's foot, he would most likely have thought, my life depends on this leg I'm hanging from. Best not take any chances. So we now have Logan imagining if the situation was reversed and what he would be doing. And he says, if the situations were reversed, I'd be going, don't do anything to make this guy drop, to let go. And what does that imply? That implies that this shanka is going to do something stupid that is likely to kill them both. A man would rather save himself than kill his enemy. And this is actually, this is an insight into Logan's character. It's so easy to skip over this, to gloss over this, to think, it's just some idle rumination. But think about what this means for Logan as a character. A man would rather save himself than kill his enemy. Self-preservation and pragmatism are ruling Logan's psyche. That's part of his character. It's more important to survive and fight another day than to kill yourself killing an enemy. And also think of how it's phrased. A man would rather save himself. And we know that the shanka, this thing that's being referenced, is not a man. So again, this is supporting the implication that we get from my life depends on this leg I'm hanging from. Best not take any chances. A man would rather save himself than kill his enemy. So both those things are now suggesting that this shanka would rather kill his enemy than save himself or itself. This shanka is going to do something incredibly stupid just to get at Logan. Trouble was that the shanka didn't think that way, and Logan knew it. So Logan has been referring to them as flatheads, as shanka. So he clearly understands the species. He understands what these things are, and also knows them well enough to not only have a pejorative for them, but to have an understanding of how they think. So they're not unthinking creatures. And also they're tool wielders, using spears. And again, trouble was, not the trouble was. So Abercrombie dropped the, don't need it. Trouble was that the shanka didn't think that way. And Logan knew it. So Logan's smart. He's been able to put himself in the position of an enemy, understand how the enemy thinks, evaluate how that is going to have an impact on the current situation. All of these are signals that Logan's actually quite smart. Logan understands how to do these things. And again, because of the dropping of we get this informality. So Logan's not resting on airs. All of this is informal. It's being tied very closely to Logan's perspective. And that's why we see this permeating everything. So it wasn't much of a surprise when it opened its big mouth and sank its teeth into his calf. Once again, ending with humor. We've had this built up in this paragraph that this shanka is going to do something stupid, and it opened its big mouth. Think about that phrasing. Yes, this could mean that the shanka have very wide mouths. Absolutely literal, surface, superficial meaning. We get it. Good description. Fine. But also think of, you had to open your big mouth, didn't you? Again, a pejorative description. So Logan has a negative perception of these things. It's slightly informal. It's not academic or formalized negativity. It's very casual. So it opened its big mouth and sank its teeth into his calf. So remember, Logan is hanging there, and in the previous paragraph, we know that basically he's looked down, the shanka has looked up at him, glared at him, and then the shanka has just gone and bitten him. if if this wasn't him hanging off the side of a cliff, desperate for his life, this would be hysterical. As it is, I'm still finding it funny. Right. Be professional, AP. But it opened its big mouth and sank its teeth into his calf. So think, sank its teeth into. So again, we have that, the big bite. It's a nice colloquial expression for this. It's very informal. But also think of how visceral it is. Sank its teeth. So the depth of wound is not shallow. Sank its teeth. There's a depth to it. There's a viciousness to it. In addition to it being this nice informal idiom. Ah! Logan grunted and squealed and kicked out as hard as he could with his bare heel, kicked a bloody gash in the shanka's head, but it wouldn't stop biting, and the harder he kicked, the more his hand slipped on the greasy root above. So we've gone from, in that previous paragraph, it was actually quite short sentences, much longer sentence here. So remember what I had said in the previous video. When Abercrombie has used these long sentences with lots of clauses, it's signaling here's one sentence, and in this one sentence, all of this stuff is going to happen. So in a weird way, this is a different way of showing a lot of action in a short space of time. Obviously, one of the other ways of doing it is in one paragraph, having lots of very short sentences so that as you read, you're hitting all of these different sentences one after the other. Here, we're having a lot of different actions occurring, broken up by the commas, but all in one sentence to achieve the same effect. And again, we have Logan grunted and squealed. He isn't acting like a stereotypical or tropey or cliched fantasy character. Like he has whimpered, he's grunted, he's squealed. He's making a lot of noises that aren't heroic, stoic, or cliched fantasy noises. This is quite realistic. People make odd noises when they're in pain. He kicked out as hard as he could with his bare heel. And this is a nice moment of recall that at the very beginning, we were told he was running through the forest, running through these trees in bare feet. So it's a nice reminder, tying back to that opening. In case you missed it at the very beginning, here it is again, just as a little tiny reminder to help the reader along. So it's nicely tied in. It consolidates what's there. Kicked a bloody gash. So not just kicked a gash, but a bloody gash. So he caused a bad wound. This again signals a type of tone and approach to violent description here, that it's not going to shy away from the fact that it is visceral, that it is real. It's just these little tiny moments that give you this sense of the grittiness and the realism or the verisimilitudinous of nature of this world. Violence has consequences. Violence is graphic and cruel. Violence and wounds are not nice. And there's no shying away from this. This has all been quite explicit, not gratuitous. Gratuitous is a different thing, but explicit in what the nature of violence is. And it's actually quite good. Well, at least I think so. I think this is really good. But it wouldn't stop biting. And the harder he kicked, the more his hands slipped on the greasy root above. So he's kicked the shanka to try, stop biting me, we're both going to die. But it keeps biting him. And he keeps kicking him then to stop it biting him. But the more that he is kicking, the more his hands are slipping. And we suddenly see this predicament, making the situation even worse. His hands are slipping down this route. Remember, it's not a rope. It's not this perfect handhold. It is a natural tree root that's just sticking out there that he's holding on to. And we're told it's greasy. So if we remember, why would the root be greasy? You know, tree roots, they're typically dry. Well, number one, it's a living tree root. So there's going to be all sorts of actual fluid inside the root that as you're grabbing it, it's going to damage the surface of the root and lead to some of that leaking. So like things like sap and is it phylum and phloem or xylem or something. I don't know. Been a long time since I studied biology. But it's a greasy tree root. Also, we were told the ground was wet. His hands are covered in mud. All of these things are making this hold even more precarious. And to make it worse, there wasn't much root left to hold on to now. And what there was looked like snapping off at any moment. Because, of course, the further down a route you go, the narrower it gets, the thinner it gets, the more easily broken it gets. Time is running out. So this, again, is another way of signaling things are coming to a head. It's building to a moment. His hands are slipping down the route. The route itself is getting shorter and the route might break. Each thing adding to this tension. He tried to think past the pain in his hands, the pain in his arms, the flathead's teeth in his leg. So Logan is experiencing multiple sources of pain. Again, makes the world more real, makes Logan more human as a character. But what's he trying to do? He's trying to think past the pain. He's trying to convince himself, don't think about the pain, think about what you're going to do. What I like about this is, again, it emphasizes his humanity. There are a number of fantasy heroes, a number of fantasy characters who they dismiss the pain by sheer will. It's one of those tropes that, quite frankly, annoys me a little bit. And I really like that here is a character who can't do that. Who can, oh, it's just a flesh wound. Oh, don't worry about, oh, a broken leg. I'll just walk on it. He's genuinely in pain and he is trying, not necessarily succeeding. He tried to think past the pain. He's trying to clear his head to come up with anything because time is running out. The only choice was between falling on rocks or falling on water. And that was a choice that more or less made itself. So notice here that he has absolutely dismissed the option of getting rid of the shanka. There's no way he can get the shanka off his leg. It has a firm grip and it's biting him. He's not going to be able to get rid of it in time. So that choice has already been discarded. Can he pull himself up and the shanka up just by climbing up the tree root? No, that's not physically possible. He's already discarded that. So even though those would be options, Logan's already assessed it and gone, those aren't actual options. There's no need to even contemplate them. Those cannot happen. So why bother thinking about it? It'd be like, oh, and if I grew wings, I could probably fly. It's not going to happen. Don't even bother wasting your time contemplating it. What he focuses on is, well, what are my actual options? I am going to fall. So here we know he is going to fall. That's a foregone conclusion. There is no climbing up here. He is going to fall. So he now has to decide how he is going to fall. Close to the cliff face or try to aim for the water. And again, that informal, humorous way of putting it, that was a choice that more or less made itself. Because if your choice is between landing on rocks or landing on water, you're going to choose water. Is it a perfect option? No, but between rocks and water, you're going to go for water. Once you've got a task to do, it's better to do it than to live with the fear of it. That's what Logan's father would have said. So again, we have this kind of dipping into Logan's brain, the thing that is making him act the way that he acts. He has all of these things that he has learned over time that have been drilled into him. And apparently this little nugget was what Logan's father would have always said to him, which is once you've got a task to do, it's better to do it than to live with the fear of it. If you know you have, don't put off till tomorrow what you can do today. You know something is going to be difficult. Stop worrying about it being difficult. Just start doing it because you have to do it. Again, a down to earth, straightforward, no fancy prose. This is honest advice given by a real person to a real person. Once you've got a task to do, it's better to do it than to live with the fear of it. And we understand that. We can see, because it's tied into the previous paragraph of this choice more or less made itself. And once you know that's the choice, and once you know rock or water, it has to be water, then why put off? Just act now. You know you have to do it. This second, the next second, 5 seconds, 5 minutes from now, you're still going to have to do it. So you might as well just do it. That's what we're being told here. So we know exactly what Logan is going to do, or at least it is heavily foreshadowed. We know this is coming. That's what Logan's father would have said. So nice, implying Logan, yes, like everyone had a family. He had a dad. And again, the narrator is letting us know that Logan has a backstory, that Logan has a history, that Logan actually comes from somewhere. He hasn't just been conjured up by this author for this scene and is just a cardboard cutout of a character. He's a realized character. And we've gotten an implication now of history. And it's a nice little way of adding that into the narrative. So he planted his free foot firmly on the rock face, took one last deep breath, and flung himself out into empty space with all the strength he had left. So again, Abercrombie uses this slightly elongated sentence to show this is all basically one continuous action. He planted his free foot firmly on the rock, because obviously the shanka is attached to the other one and biting. So he's using the other one, which is a nice, again, reminder of he only has one foot free. Both of his hands are desperately gripping onto this rock. We just get a reminder of all of this. This is actually really good description that is paying attention to everything that has happened thus far. So he plants his foot firmly on the rock. So look at that, free foot firmly. We get that f, that this is deliberate. There is force to it. And it's just, again, very cleverly done. Took one last deep breath and flung himself out. So free foot firmly. We've just used up a whole lot of breath saying that because of the th noise. Took one last deep breath because brace yourself, and flung himself out into empty space with all the strength he had left. This is the last act of a desperate man. Is this all going to go wrong? He felt the biting teeth let go of him, then the grasping hands, and for a moment, he was free. So if this was cinema, you can just imagine there'd been like the shot of the close-up of him looking at his hands and then looking down, and you get that perspective shot where he's looking down at the shanka, and then it's sort of panned out for a second, or cut out to a medium wide shot where we can see the whole struggle going on. Then a zoom in of the shanka, like biting onto his leg. We can imagine all of these different shots. And then in this one, we can imagine the close-up of the foot going against the cliff face and him bracing himself, taking that deep breath and throwing himself backwards. And this is where we would almost imagine the slow motion of seeing him fall, of the shanka falling away. We get a sense of all of that because this is exactly how, we would see it in an action movie. That's what we're seeing here. We're seeing the recreation of that sequence on the page, which is really nice. It's a nice cinematic sequence. I like how this has been done. But we had biting teeth, grasping hands. So again, not just the shanka fell away. Again, focusing on the very visceral things that had been attacking Logan. all tied into Logan's perspective. The biting teeth that were biting into his leg, they're now gone. The grasping hands that were holding onto him, they are now gone. It's not about the shanka fell away, because that's treating the shanka as a full individual. It's about the different impacts on Logan himself, tied into his perspective and his perception of the scene. And for a moment, he was free. And you almost have that, where they're falling away, and for like a brief second, it's the smile on their face, and then they realize, oh no, I'm actually gonna fall. Um, it it's just cute. I like it. Then he began to fall. So if you think he pushed off, he sort of jumped away, and for that one little moment, he was weightless. And then gravity, has never let go, but it has taken hold and is now accelerating him downward. So then he began to fall, full stop, fast, full stop. Just emphasize, then he began to fall, fast. And it's just a nice way to break up that sentence to emphasize it. The sides of the gorge flashed past, grey rock, green moss, patches of white snow, all tumbling around him. So fast, flashed, tumbling. Again, this sense of speed, this sense of alacrity, the sense of pace. The sides of the gorge flashed past. So it's a blur, and it's grey rock. He doesn't have time to identify. He's just seeing colors. So it's this blur of color as he's falling. Grey rock, green moss, patches of white snow. Very clear scene, nicely relayed, tied into Logan's perspective. And one of the things that's nice here, patches of white snow. So again, we return to this whole scene was set up with slush on the ground. That Abercrombie has not forgotten this, that this is worked back into the description just to continue to consolidate the scene, to make sure that the reader is reassured. This is cohesive. This is happening in a place that makes sense. Logan turned over slowly in the air, limbs flailing pointlessly, too scared to scream. And again, this is really nicely done. He threw himself out in the air, and he's slowly sort of tumbling. As he's falling, he is slowly rotating, because he didn't do like a perfect Olympic divers dive where they're in perfect control of their body and they know what they're doing. No, this was all kind of uncontrolled, and he doesn't know what he's doing. Limbs flailing pointlessly. What is waving your arms going to do at this point? You still do it as you're falling, going, ah. But there's no point to it. So it's pointing out that obvious. And then too scared to scream. Again, Logan is very human. He has human emotions, and he is experiencing fear in this moment. He's going to die. He's falling off a cliff. This isn't jumping off a cliff down towards the water, and going, like people do when they're cliff jumping. No. This is, he threw himself off, and he is absolutely petrified. The rushing wind whipped at his eyes, tugged at his clothes, plucked the breath out of his mouth. Look at that use of, so the rushing wind, again, the speed, but also the noise of it being emphasized. So the speed of his descent, creating this wind, whipped at his eyes. So again, emphasizing force, speed, and violence. Tugged at his clothes. Again, this pulling motion, that this is forceful. Plucked the breath out of his mouth. All of this, his breath being stolen because he's falling at a great rate off a cliff. This is not good. He saw the big shanka hit the rock face beside him. So as he's falling down, he got to push slightly further away than the shanka, and he is clearly very close to this cliff face because he sees the shanka hit the rock face beside him. He saw it break and bounce and flop off, dead for sure. This is very realistic, but also very unpleasant because the shanka, which has been referred to as it or the, never given a gender, never given a personality, never given any of these things, but seen very pejoratively. But now it has actually just become a corpse, a thing. He saw it break and bounce and flop off. That this is just meat now. This isn't a creature anymore. And it is very brutal and visceral. And what's interesting is Abercrombie has slowed down the descent here so the reader can see this. Because if you remember, everything was going really, really quickly. It flashed past grey rock, green moss, patches of white. Everything is so quick. But as he's turned round, as he's fallen, he's noticed the shanka has hit the rock and bounced off. That he really should have gone past by now. But again, this is narrative. It's slightly artificial. And so it's giving us that satisfaction of seeing this, of zooming in, of the camera taking that moment to show us this, even when you go, that's added about 3 seconds to his fall that he didn't have. But we forgive moments like that for the dramatic tension, for the needs of the narrative. It serves the narrative purpose. That was a pleasing sight, but Logan's satisfaction was short-lived. So Logan's happy, the guy that basically caused all of this is dead, but as we know, he's falling now as well. And so his satisfaction is going to be short-lived. And that, using that term, short-lived, the implication that Logan could die, building up this this fear, because remember, it's called the end. And now his satisfaction is going to be short-lived, and he is falling. There's that little moment of, is Logan actually going to die? Is this going to be a main character from the series? Is this a prelude to all of the other stuff that's going to happen? Is this some sort of incident that's going to tie into the main narrative? We don't know. The water came up to meet him. So again, because everything's from Logan's perspective, the water is coming up. Obviously, the water isn't. It's sitting there flat. So again, Abercrombie consistently has used Logan's perspective to focalize this narrative. Very consistently. Really well done. It hit him in the side like a charging bull, punched the air out of his lungs, knocked the sense out of his head, sucked him in and down into the cold darkness. So we start with that. The water came up to meet him, short sentence. And then all of these things happen at once. And this is the technique he's used again and again. A long sentence, lots of little clauses, but instead of it finishing, there's an ellipsis. There's a ... What happened next? Hit, charging, punched, knocked, well, sucked him in, okay. But hit, charging, punched, knocked, like all of this violent language, emphasizing this impact. Very descriptive, letting you visualize it and almost feel it. It ties in with the tone of everything else. And I think it's a really nice prologue. Finishing on this point, it finishes on this, what's going to happen next? You know, it's fun, it's interesting, it does what a prologue is meant to do. It makes you intrigued about this world. We have the Shanka. What are they? I don't know. Logan, is he important? I don't know. Did he survive? I don't know. I want to read more to find out. It's a hook. It's a narrative hook to try and get you interested in this narrative. There's a lot of stuff here, lots of action, lots of good description, lots of humor worked into it. It's a very engaging style. And so I think this works really well as a prologue. So thankfully, that was a lot shorter than the first video on this. And I think you can see the style that Abercrombie has gone for in this prologue. The words, it's not a upper level, academic, overly complicated style of language. Uh, a lot of easily understood, simple vocabulary, but used so well that Abercrombie is using all of these terms, these descriptive terms, these adjectives, fun ways to use nouns, using gerunds to give that active description instead of passive. All of the stuff that Abercrombie has done has made this very engaging, very accessible. His command over the sentence structure to do that thing with the long sentence with lots of subclauses to give you a sense of a lot of things happening at once. So the different approach to pacing and how that's been done through it. We've seen his use of this limited third person, this third person focalization, tying all of the narrative into Logan's perspective. And that's really well done throughout. All of this is a great hook, and just in terms of the writing, a great hook and a taster for what the book is going to be. You read the prologue. Is this the kind of writing? Is this the kind of story that I want to read? It action packed, violence. The violence was well described, not gratuitous, but it was violent. It was brutal. He didn't linger over it. He didn't lovingly describe these things, but there was a clearness and a clarity to the violence to make sure that, that violence is brutal. So we have all of that stuff about the language. We see all of this action in it that we go, oh, well, this signals that this is perhaps going to be like an action book, and we might be interested in that. And then we have the narrative, the actual story being told here of Logan running in bare feet through a forest. Why is he in bare feet? What happened? There's a whole story here that we don't know about. This is really interesting. And he has this scrap with these shanka or flatheads. Like, what are they? What's going on? This is curious. I want to know more about this world. It's a fantasy world, but I don't know what's happening. And then he falls off a cliff and there's a ... Did he die? We don't know. I want to read more to find out. This is one of the ways that you can use a prologue to hook a reader in. So I thought this was a fun one. It's very different to some of the other prologues that I've looked at, because people use prologues and preludes for entirely different reasons. And I think this is a really good one to illustrate the whole narrative hook to draw a reader in. And, again, one of the big things to remember here is this was Abercrombie's first book. Absolutely great. I really enjoyed it. But I hope you've enjoyed this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.